only 3% of the world's population moves from their country of origin to another country, right? So 97% of people are staying home. And that's why I think it is actually important to think about what allows people to stay home, because by and large, people want to stay home if they can. But for the 3% of people who are moving, right, I think countries, not just the United States, but many countries, European Union, Australia, have decided that this is the crisis itself, the actual movement of people. And I want to encourage us to think about, what does that creation of crisis do? Who benefits from that creation of crisis, and who is harmed?
Good evening. My name is Susan Spurlock. I'm Executive Director of the Ward Hall Forum at Suffolk University. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program with Ragini Shah upon the publication of her new book, Constructed Movements, Extraction and Resistance in Mexican Migrant Communities. Constructed Movements centers stories from communities in Mexico profoundly affected by immigration to the United States, to show how migration extracts resources along racial lines. Shah chronicles how three interrelated dynamics, the maldistribution of public resources, the exploitation of migrant labor, and the United States immigration enforcement regime, entrenched the necessity of migration as a strategy for survival in Mexico. She also highlights the alternative visions elaborated by migrant community organizations that seek to end the conditions that force migration. Recognizing that reform without recompense will never right an unjust migratory system. Shah concludes with a forceful call for the United States and Mexican governments to make abolitionist investments and reparative compensation to directly counteract this legacy of extraction. This is a very timely and important time in the history of our country as we look at migration at the forefront of our news every day, more and more distressing and disturbing headlines that we read every day. So it's now my pleasure to ask Shannon to kick off our program.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It's really great because we're also press siblings in book publishing, and I'm really thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you and with the rest of you here at the law school. I always joke that though I am not a lawyer, I hang out with a lot of them, and so I hope that this gives me some credibility in this audience. I want to start by saying that this book, for me, was a refreshing read on a couple of different points. One, I just really was impressed by the way in which the author was able to bring together both the doctrinal insights of your legal training as well as the very on-the-ground insights of your work as a clinician, and the deep theoretical questions that social scientists and I think migration scholars more generally have been thinking about as it relates not only to the migration context between the United States and Mexico, but displacement more broadly. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing both about your journey to this work as well as where do we go from here. So I'm going to walk us through a series of questions regarding the book, and then hopefully we'll be able to have a broader conversation in a bit. So the first thing I think many of us are wondering, and we hope that you could start with, is to tell us about your story in coming to this work. You won a Fulbright to do this ethnography, and I'm very curious what drew you to this aspect of your professional journey, and how would you say that you navigate your own kind of research or positionality during this work? You wear many different hats, and in these communities you play probably a very distinct role. And so can you tell us about that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to start, I'll answer that question, but I do want to start by thanking Ford Hall Forum for having this book be part of the series. I want to thank everybody who's here for coming. There's former research assistants who've worked on this book here. There's former students from the clinic who are part of the clinic, throughout the process of researching, writing, et cetera, who are here. And thank you really so much to Shannon for coming all the way from Ithaca for this event. I've learned so much from your insights, both in terms of your reads of the book's content, but also just in terms of thinking about immigrant organizing and immigrant organizations. So just like you like to hang out with lawyers, I think I like to hang out with social scientists. I'm a lawyer who thinks that she's a social scientist now. So it's really lovely to have this conversation with you. So my story in terms of, how I ended up doing this research is that I was practicing law for about 13 years, both on my own and then with students for most of that time. And I think one of the things that we focus on a lot in legal storytelling, right, is you are asking people about their lives, about the conditions in their home countries when you're doing immigration work anyway. But it's to reach a sort of very specific kind of way to frame the story for the legal claim. And so what we were finding out, I felt like had some limitations. And the primary limitation that I was noticing came from both interacting with clients, but also interacting with community organizers and just community members, many of whom were pointing out that a lot of the conditions that were making people leave had to do with the impacts of US policies, US interventions, whether they were economic or military, or increasingly climate change focused. And I felt like that part of the story was not something we could really tell when we were doing legal storytelling. It's not something that makes you eligible for any kind of immigration benefit. And I just felt like it was such an important part of the story that was missing from the analysis. And so I started to think about, what could I do to bring that analysis to the fore? And I realized I could do a theoretical project about it, but I really wanted to get a sense of, what people were talking about here was some of the impacts that people were facing in terms of conditions of poverty that are created or conditions of scarcity, other kinds of scarcity that are created. And I wanted to see if I could go to communities and talk to people about those conditions there in the countries outside the US, to see just how far this impact really went. And so that's what really led me to apply for the Fulbright. I also knew very well that although, again, I do a lot of my colleagues from the clinics are here, we do a lot of coaching of our students on interviewing. So we spend a lot of time thinking about interviewing and how do you build relationships, how do you actively listen, how do you follow up, fill in gaps. But obviously, interviewing for lawyering is different than interviewing for empirical research. And so I did want to make sure that if I was going to go and interview people that I had some training. So I ended up applying for a Fulbright for that reason as well. And through my research found that the University of Guadalajara has a program where they conduct empirical research every year, and they could both train me and they sort of welcomed me to be part of one of the research trips that they were taking. So that was really kind of how I ended up getting there.
Great. And you work with a number of our colleagues there in sociology, so that's a great exchange. And I have to say that we as sociologists also learned so much from these clinical and doctrinal perspectives. I really couldn't do my work without being in conversation with legal practitioners and trying to get a sense, again, not only about the legal bureaucracy that I attempt to write about, but also just the experiences of folks navigating that. So I think that's a real contribution. I also wonder, though, obviously proximity to Mexico is a very compelling part of this, but this story really could be told in so many places. And so both, beyond Mexico, but actually even within Mexico. And so I wondered, could you tell us a bit about how and why you settled on these 4 places, Tabasco, Oaxaca, Tlaxcala, and Puebla, both from an empirical research design, but also from a kind of researcher access and an ethnographic perspective?
Yeah, so I think particularly given that I've done the majority of my legal work here in Boston, Mexico may not seem like such an obvious choice as a place to research conditions because the majority of the populations, immigrant populations that we have in this area are not from Mexico, right? We have a lot of people from Central America, Brazil, Haiti. And so the primary reason why Mexico was because I had done my language immersion program there and had the majority of my professional and personal connections there. And as somebody who is bilingual and bicultural in one language, in Gujarati, which is my home language, and then consider myself fluent in Spanish, but certainly not bicultural, I sort of knew that I needed to be in a place where I had some understanding of cultural norms beyond what I learned from legal representation. Because it is true that when we're working with clients from different parts of the world, we are obviously trying to understand the cultural context they're coming from, but we're not with them in their cultural context. And so having spent really quite a long time in Mexico before I went back to do the Fulbright, and also having the folks there who I knew could help me navigate some of the cultural issues that I knew would come up in the responses people were giving was the reason why I chose Mexico. And then in particular, the states that you mentioned, Tabasco, I found out from the University of Guadalajara when I joined them that was the state that they were going to do research that year. And so I was very happy to be able to accompany them there. One of the reasons they chose Tabasco is because that's a state that's not as widely studied amongst migration scholars. And so it was an opportunity to see what was happening in a place that maybe everyone else hadn't already written about. Unlike states like Jalisco and actually Oaxaca, which is another state that's in the book, have been written about a little bit more extensively. But then after the research in Tabasco, I felt like what I needed was some places that I could compare what I'd heard in Tabasco to. And I needed places that were geographically and demographically different. So in Tabasco, most of the people that I interviewed did not strongly identify as indigenous. And Tabasco itself has a more recent history of migration to the US. So people starting to come in the 1990s. The places I happened to go to were places that were really heavily relied on kind of seafood-based industries. They were coastal. It is a tropical climate, so to the extent that there's agriculture, it's that kind of agriculture. So I was looking for places that were different, and I also, again, needed access to the communities that I was seeking to interview. And so both finding places that were different and places that had organizations that would give me access led me to Oaxaca, which is, I worked with an organization called Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, which is the indigenous front of binational organizations. And in Tlaxcala, I worked with the Centro de Atención de Familias Migrantes Indígenas, which is the basically the care center for indigenous migrant families. And so that's kind of how that ended up being the places.
Thanks. And I think that this conversation is really apt given kind of where a lot of sociologists are thinking right now in terms of ethnographic work. The great Michael Buravoy, many of you may have heard, recently passed away, and some of my colleagues here also trained with him. And I remember him telling me once, just get in the field, right? And so you can make all these decisions and kind of predetermine research design, but as you move into your research and do the ethnographic work, kind of the logic of the story you're telling in this kind of grounded ethnography way only later comes to bear. And so you have to have a plan to make it in, but that plan can't be so predetermined that you know from the start what you're going to find. And so I don't mean to say that you had to have everything set out, but that's, I think, one of the kind of key insights that ethnographers teach us. But the work that you're doing is not only, I think, innovative in terms of the empirical approach and being able to think through these questions and multiple sites within one of the largest migrant sending countries in North America, but also you are offering us a theoretical approach that is, I think, distinct both from typical legal analysis and, I think, sociological work. And so there's no shortage, I think, of work these days that seeks to flesh out the origins and the functions of what we often refer to as racial capitalism as a system of entrenched inequality. But one of the things that you add to this story that I wondered if you could talk a little bit about is a relational perspective in terms of really illuminating who are the actors in this system and how do they relate to each other and migrants themselves. And so you talk about kind of industry leaders, labor, workers themselves, coyotes and other intermediaries, and of course the enforcement regime, both on both sides of the border. And so tell us a little bit more about why this was an important turn in your analysis and how did it differ from some of the work that you were reading both as a lawyer and as a budding social scientist?
Yeah, I think this is where I'll cue the slides, if that's okay. And I think ultimately I came to analyzing what I was hearing from people, what I was seeing in communities in Mexico through the lens of racial capitalism because it best fit what I was hearing from people. So I went to Mexico first to understand, why is it that people are leaving their home communities? And is there some relationship between the reasons that they're leaving and, U.S. policies? And so that was the initial research question. But once I got to these communities, I realized that I was meeting a lot of family members who were left behind and were struggling to make ends meet, even though they were getting a good amount, actually, of their loved one's salary in the United States. So a lot of the migrants were sending, almost half their salaries, in some cases more than half their salaries, back to their families, but it still wasn't managing to cover all of the expenses to the extent where the person in the United States could come back to the home community. And then I was also seeing, the organizing itself. Now, I mentioned earlier that the reason I chose Oaxaca, Tlaxcala, Puebla is because there were organizations through which I could work with people, but I didn't realize the organizations themselves were going to become a big part of the book. And they really did because there was so much that they were doing to try to address some of the issues that were coming up. And they were pointing things out to me about the limitations of remittances because of the enormous amounts of divestment that had occurred to these communities in the first place, that there really wasn't a way for remittances to fill those gaps. And so through those stories, I started to realize that there were these kind of what I call the three phases of migration as extraction, which is what is depicted on this slide. And that, there's a relationship, as you mentioned, Shannon, between the entities that engaged in divestment or that operated to divest. So that included the Mexican government, which did make a decision to reduce spending on things like education, agricultural subsidies, et cetera. But also, that decision wasn't made in a vacuum. That decision was made because the Mexican government found itself in a crisis and was then essentially not forced, but sort of encouraged to enter into a set of agreements with the International Monetary Fund, whose prescriptions for countries that get loans from the IMF is that they have to reduce all of these subsidies, right? They have to reduce subsidies, they have to suppress wages, they have to open up markets to foreign investment, they have to privatize previously public industries. These are all the prescriptions, and these are across the board, to countries across the board, not just Mexico. But Mexico really embraced these reforms in ways that I think some other countries maybe resisted a little bit more. And so Mexico is known as one of the most liberalized countries in the world. It's one of the sort of best environments for business, but one of the worst environments if what you're trying to do is poverty reduction. So those same entities, the US government in particular, is also involved then in pulling people that they've now dislocated from their home communities into the United States. So the same people who now cannot make a living off of their farm in Mexico are now working as agricultural workers in a US corporate farm. And because the vast majority of them are without authorization, that puts them in a position for maximum exploitation, right? And so they're able to extract resources from those workers in ways that may not be possible if they had a more secure status. Now, I will say, I don't necessarily think just having legal status is the answer, and I could talk more about that in Q&A or in other questions, but the lack of legal status does make you extra exploitable. And then the lack of legal status also gives the justification for enormous amounts of spending on enforcement. And so, enforcement spending, and I'll just go to this other slide real quick. Enforcement spending is really interesting because it doesn't necessarily increase or decrease in ways that seem rational. So this slide kind of shows on the right-hand side, for those of you it's your left-hand side, for those of you who are in the room, is the blue graph shows the changes in enforcement spending from 1991 to 2010. I know the numbers are a little bit small. And then on the right is the number of people who entered the country without authorization in those years. And so what you'll see is that enforcement spending actually increased when unauthorized entries were decreasing, right? And so what accounts for that? And my argument is that it is precisely the moment when private industries start entering into the enforcement space. And so part of the explanation for why we are investing so much in enforcement, even when people are actually less likely to be entering without authorization, is that this is a profit-making venture. And then going to the third kind of part of the three phases of migration as extraction, once a person is in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, and sort of making money, sending money back to their loved ones, they can send, 50% of their salary, and that will absolutely help their loved ones pay for clothing, food, might even help pay for an education, because the education spending, which I forgot to show this graph, shows, again on the left, shows the reductions in public education and agricultural spending over a certain number of years, right? So once that spending on public education decreases, you have essentially semi-private schools in most rural areas. So people are paying huge amounts of money to send their children to school. So remittances might be able to pay for a particular child's education, but it's not going to improve the overall educational access in a community. And so, again, you have the same forces who originally said, let's go ahead and reduce all of these expenditures, the Mexican government, the US government, the International Monetary Fund, other international organizations, now saying, you know what will be really great for development in these communities would be remittances from migrants. That's what we're going to use. That's the money that we're going to use to develop these communities. Not the reinvestment by the state, but investment by the very people who were displaced by the policies that they instituted in the first place. And so that's, I talk about it more in the book because it's a really widespread, I think, kind of mantra amongst development economists that remittances will lead to development. But in fact, what I saw in communities is that remittances wasn't leading to development. It was leading to individual families doing better, but not necessarily a community-wide effect. And so why I chose the kind of analytical tool of racial capitalism to understand all of this is because there's an intentionality in all of these programs, right? So we can talk about places like, for example, the Mixteca region of Oaxaca as being poor. You might say that place is poor. But what's really more accurate to say is that it has been made poor. It's been made poor by policies. You can also say that people lack immigration status. But the reality is that people are made to lack immigration status, right? You're made legal or made illegal by immigration policies. And so I think racial capitalism is useful because it gets at that intentionality. The essential insight of racial capitalism, for those of you who aren't as familiar with those of us who talk about this term all the time, is that in order for the relationships that are within capitalism that require exploitation in order to accumulate wealth to work, you have to keep creating new or deploy existing racial categories, right? So racial stratification is a part of what capitalism needs in order to continually allow for the accumulation of wealth for some at the expense of others. And in this case, I would say the Mexican and US governments, and even some of the corporations that employ Mexican workers, regularly engage in this kind of racial stratification in order to justify both policies that divest from these areas, as well as policies that bring them into the US as workers, as well as policies that seek to keep them out or incarcerate them because they're considered invaders. And so I know we're going to talk about echoes of that in the current time period, but I think that's why it's sort of a useful tool.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to leapfrog to one of our other questions that I think flows really well from this conversation. And I think in the current moment, we are all hearing a lot of conversations here, both in Boston and in other major immigrant destinations, about the need to fight immigration enforcement efforts that are fueling a very explicitly named policy priority to increase deportations. Yet part of what you and others are also encouraging us to do is to maintain this equal focus on the right to stay home, right? And that implicates not just the US government, but also the Mexican government, and also the importance of thinking about reintegration, both for individuals who return voluntarily or who are forced to return by state violence. And so can you say a little bit about this, this concept of the right to stay home in the context of what you just described in terms of investment?
Yes, absolutely. So the right to stay home, by the way, is something that I picked up from one of the organizations that I was working with. The Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales has a campaign called The Right Not to Migrate, right? And what they talk about in terms of the right not to migrate is that migration is a necessity because of all the divestment that I just talked about. And that the right not to migrate means things like investment in education, means investment in healthcare. It means it means allowing people to choose how the resources in their community are going to be used. So because in Oaxaca and Tlaxcala, Puebla, all these places, people did very strongly identify as indigenous, they also had some very strong analytic frameworks that involve self-determination, their ability to control the decision-making about how their land and how their other resources is used. So I think that actually, in a lot of ways, I think the right to stay home and the right to be free from deportation are kind of two sides of the same coin. Because ultimately, it's about who gets to decide where home is, right? Is it a person or is it a government? And, I think that the same kinds of things that people are talking about in terms of, make it possible, the arguments for make it possible for us to stay in our home communities, to thrive in our home communities, are the same kind of arguments people would make to say, well, I had to leave because it wasn't possible to stay in my home community, right? And then you sort of turn to some of the rhetoric that's being used to justify mass deportations as if it's going to magically improve economic conditions for other people, right? But the reality is that's not what improves economic conditions. I mean, I think everybody who's in this room knows this without me having to say it out loud, but it doesn't improve economic conditions to have less people with a particular kind of immigration status in a community. What it requires to improve economic conditions is reinvestment of resources, right? Investment in things like education, healthcare. Even, I would say, going back to things like subsidies, which in the United States I think feels anathema, or feels very far-fetched. But these are the things that are required in order to be able to thrive. And so maybe I'll stop there and just say that I think that it's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the promises of trade policy, going back to the North American Free Trade Agreement, was exactly that. If we liberalize these markets, that we will reduce the need and the desire of individuals to migrate. And in fact, we found the exact opposite. Right at the same time, you saw an increased militarization of the border, which again was seen to create a deterrent effect, but in fact only succeeded in doing two things. One, which is reduce the circularity of migration, and two, move those migrant crossing points to more dangerous areas, which resulted in a drastic increase in mortality, right? And so I think oftentimes, at least at the policy level, these are seen as very linked conversations. Mm-hmm. You talk through these kind of three phases of extraction in the book: dislocation, displacement, entrenchment. But you end with resistance. And I wondered, before we open it up to questions, what lessons would you like us to take from this research for our current moment?
Yeah. I mean, I think for the current moment, what I would say, and just to say specifically what the three phases of resistance are too, right? The resistance is kind of directly linked to the three modes of extraction. But I think that there are two lessons I would take for the current moment. One is that these conditions are created. So as we just talked about, the conditions making people leave and creating a lawful or an unlawful status, those are all manufactured, right, by policies that are in place. And I think that in the current moment, what we're seeing is a manufactured crisis of migration itself. The idea that a movement of people is a crisis really does ignore the actual crisis, which is what is happening that's making so many people have to move. Although I feel like it's important to remind ourselves that only 3% of the world's population moves from their country of origin to another country, right? So 97% of people are staying home. And that's why I think it is actually important to think about what allows people to stay home, because by and large, people want to stay home if they can. But for the 3% of people who are moving, right, I think countries, not just the United States, but many countries, European Union, Australia, have decided that this is the crisis itself, the actual movement of people. And I want to encourage us to think about, what does that creation of crisis do? Who benefits from that creation of crisis, and who is harmed? One of the things that the insights that I had as I was listening to people talk about what was making them leave, and then realizing all of the different policies that underlie the reasons they were leaving, and then all the people that were benefiting from people leaving, made me think about, in this moment, who's benefiting from saying migration is the real crisis. And so I look at things like the fact that GeoCorps and Palantir, who are deeply involved in immigration enforcement. GeoCorps is one of the private detention facility operators. Palantir is a surveillance technology operator that's responsible for a lot of the government surveillance technologies, and even technologies like CBP-1, which was allowing people to apply for asylum, which has been discontinued. But these companies, their stock prices are skyrocketing at the current moment, right? And then we want to ask ourselves, what is actually happening on the ground? Who's being harmed? Is the mass deportation that Trump promised, which has begun, right? Is it actually about migration? What do we take away from the fact that there are indigenous people in the United States, Navajo Nation members, who've been detained by ICE, Puerto Ricans who've been detained by ICE, right? What is this actually about? And think about how also it dovetails with telling Black federal employees that they're DEI hires, right? Is it about migration, or is it going back to what we just talked about, racial capitalism? Is it about kind of marginalizing people of color, making people illegitimate, essentially, making it so that people don't belong, whether they're US citizens or not, right? But using migration as the vehicle for that. And I think the resistance of communities in Mexico have a lot of resonance as well, because essentially what they're doing is they're doing specific things, which is what is on this slide. They are calling for the return of resources. So they're doing a lot of activism, but they're also doing a lot of just, straight up, lobbying, right? Going to public officials, sitting in their offices, talking to them, trying to get disbursements, and but also doing a lot of public actions. And then they're also in the face of the inability of the state to kind of help create local sources of income, they're creating their own sources of local income. And then the last thing that communities are doing in the face of long family separations from their loved ones is trying to recreate that fabric of connection, trying to find some creative ways to connect with their family members. And again, I think I said this earlier, but I think this helps us think about what could it look like to invest in our communities? How could that be an answer to mass deportations, right? Yes, it's important to say that these are inhumane. Yes, it's important to say that there are probably massive violations of rights occurring as these officers are going out and seeking people to arrest. But I think it's also important to say, what could we be using this money for instead? And wouldn't that have a better impact on our communities than ripping people out of their schools and houses and wherever else?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that part of your story is about migrant agency, both in the decision to migrate at both the individual level, these family decisions, these community decisions, right? Who are choosing to make that treacherous crossing in spite of the dangers inherent, but also the migrant and non-migrant agency in making demands both to the state, and so the processes of state accountability, but also making plans to not wait for the state to rescue them, right? And so the kind of what we would otherwise think of as mutual aid or co-ops or kind of the ways in which migrant communities are saving themselves as they wait for this process to play out. I think one of the insights that legal historians also provide, and which you also talk about in the book, is this idea, again, of the social production of illegality. And I think this historical focus is really important for those of us who would think about the current moment as having a particular unique, crisis element to it. When in fact, if we think about the systems that are created today, simply weren't in place when, I always like to talk about my great-grandfather's family from Kiev came through, he just came through, right? As opposed to the way my family from Mexico came through, right? And even so, those policies have changed over the last 4 decades. And so I think the historical piece of this is also important, and the kind of through line of this is that migrant communities have always adjusted throughout these different upheavals, both in relation to the market, but also in relation to state oppression and repression. Any of us who've traveled through Latin America, in most of the big cities, you will see almost a permanent encampment outside of large ministries of justice, often being held vigil by indigenous communities, thinking about the whole host of injustices that are being brought to bear upon them. And migration is only one part of that story. And I think your book helps us to kind of focus that broader conversation. So one of the things that both of our work attempts to do, but which I think that most US immigration scholar audiences need a reorientation to, is the importance of focusing on the governments of the country of origin, or what we sometimes refer to as the migrant sending state. And this kind of transnational, transborder lens becomes important both in terms of the civil society activism that we're looking at, but also in terms of the very clear policy debates that are happening binationally and even regionally. And so can you tell us a little bit more about why, despite the fact that US immigration scholarship, and especially legal scholarship, is so US focused, what's the important piece here? And what do we lose by ignoring the role of, in this case, Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, Shannon, that you've done a lot of work on this as well, and kind of thinking about the role of the Mexican state in helping the diaspora community in the United States. And I think that, this book really focuses on the role that the Mexican state has had in kind of I don't want to, collaborating, I guess is the right word, collaborating with the US government and corporate interests in the United States to ensure that there's a ready supply of labor. So there have been actually somewhat active policies that the Mexican government has engaged in the past to send workers to the United States. They talk about how they're, the rural areas are backwards. And again, going back to this like racialization of people as backwards, and that they could go to the United States and modernize and sort of learn modern farming techniques. As far back as the dictator Porfirio Diaz, who was dictator throughout the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there have been leaders in Mexico who essentially enter into agreements with U.S. leaders to send workers to the U.S. And probably the most formal way that was done was through what was called the Bracero Accords. These were treaties that were entered into between Mexico and the U.S. between the 1940s and the 1960s, from the 1940s all the way to the 1960s, so sort of a 25-year period. And then I will say that the other role the Mexican state plays, at least in terms of, how it sort of impacts not the people in the book directly, because everyone who I interviewed who's in the book is a citizen of Mexico. But the Mexican government at the time that I was doing my research was also increasingly involved in helping the United States enforce our immigration laws. So there were U.S. Funding to increase the size of the Mexican Immigration Agency that would then stop people crossing from Guatemala into Mexico. And by the time now that the book has come out, Mexico is now just as large, has just as many deportations of Central Americans as the U.S. does. So it's a big player in terms of the enforcement regime. And I did interview a number of Central Americans while I was doing my research for this book. I didn't end up having their stories be part of the book just because I couldn't figure out a way to get them in, but I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk about the fact that, many of them talked about one of the things that they were most afraid of was getting around the Mexican immigration authorities, right? Not to mention, organized crime and all the other things that they were facing. And so I think that ignoring the migrant sending state, one, I think the biggest danger is it gives us an incomplete picture, but I also think that it ignores the ways in which U.S. policies are being replicated and the conditions that occur here for people here are also being replicated, or actually even in worse ways outside the United States. So to the extent that policies here are creating poverty for people, that's operating at an even worse level outside the country. And so, I think we ignore the ways in which other countries collaborate with the United States to make these kind of transfers of people happen possible at our own peril.
No, and I think that Mexico really inhabits a very unique position in the region, both in relation to the United States. In fact, one of the often overlooked conversations is that one of the largest unauthorized, technically, populations in Mexico is Americans, right? Yeah. And what that means for local economies in terms of tourism, investment, and how places like Puerto Vallarta and other places have completely remade their coastlines to cater to both the expats living there, but also the tourism industry. But also Mexico, in relation to the question of Central American migration, is in tension in the same way we see here with low-wage Mexican workers who often have the same instincts that we have heard here to the influx of migrants and the kind of crabs in the bucket response to disinvestment in their own communities. And these civil societies organizations are navigating the irony of the Mexican government emerging as one of the biggest champions of Mexicans abroad, while at the same time disinvesting in their own population and violating the rights of Central American and other migrants transiting through the country. And so I think this becomes an important part both of the the regional politics, but also the national debates happening around the dinner table, and how these social movement groups are creating and trying to navigate these often very complicated relationships with coalitions. And so I'm going to pause here and see if we have any other questions. Otherwise, I have a follow-up
we have
to
some
this.
hands.
So
Okay, great.
Thanks very much. My name's Maura. I'm a humanitarian researcher. I do a lot of work on expansion of European borders and looking at movement in Europe. And so I'm just really grateful for and can't wait to read the book. But kind of piggybacking on what you were just saying about the social movements and particularly the work that you were able to do with the organizations in Mexico, I think we've talked a lot about tonight how at a government level, policies, particularly policies of securitization, governments talk to each other at a global level. Do you see these organizations having capacity or interest or ability to also connect at a global level when we do see similarities, say, between Mexico and other both sending countries as it is, as well as a country of movement that people are moving through?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So FIAB, one of the organizations I mentioned, is a binational organization. So they work with people in Mexico and the United States. So that's not quite the same as working with people from other sending countries, but they do work, as does CAFAMI, on ensuring humanitarian passage. So there was a visa, essentially. At the time that I was doing research in Mexico, there was the ability for Central Americans to access a visa, a transit visa through Mexico. And both groups were doing work to try to help ensure that people were, in fact, able to access those visas. So I'd say that's one way that people were participating. I think Tlaxcala, more than Oaxaca, just geographically, Tlaxcala is on the route, whereas Oaxaca is a little bit further west and isn't quite on the route. But beyond that, I would say, that a lot of the work in these communities is around indigenous self-determination. And so to that extent, they weren't necessarily doing work with other communities around migration per se, but more around what does self-determination look like. And some of that is about being able to make migration more of a choice as opposed to a necessity. So that's another way that groups were involved with Mayan organizations in Guatemala, with indigenous organizations in other parts of Latin America, and even beyond Latin America.
We have a Zoom question, and then I'm going to get back to a couple of in-person questions. Our Zoom question is from Sergio, who says, I like that you mentioned the indigenous perspectives of shared lands, self-determination. Could you speak more to the organizations you worked with? Were their structures or even training styles different or similar to the ways in which resistance movements in the U.S. have been using social media to provide legal rights information? I feel there is a connection there that can aid in resistance movements.
So I'll say a little bit about each organization. So FIAB is a really old organization. They've been around since the 1970s, and they are organized in a way that tries to build collective power of the various communities in which they operate. So they operate as I might not have mentioned this, they operate in an area of Oaxaca which speaks Mixteco. And so they are, not just operating as a sort of non-governmental organization, but they're also trying to solidify some of the structures that exist in the Mixteco community of self-governance. So one of those is asambleas, where it's sort of like a direct democracy form of governance. Everybody shows up and discusses decision-making, and they sort of make decisions together, and then try to implement. There's certain people in charge of implementing those decisions. And so the social movement aspect of FIAB is mostly around when they make decisions about, for example, trying to get resources for a particular project, then they will activate their base around those kinds of ability to get those resources. So they'll go to the municipal offices or the state offices, whoever it is. They don't actually use social media that much, or at least they didn't when I was there. So I think it's really much more kind of old school organizing, where it's like a door to door, it's like a come meet in person. This is a fairly geographically large area. So, some of the organizers, they're driving, 3-4 hours in the course of a day to get from one community to another. But that's really their mode of organizing. And then Kafami is really interesting because Kafami is 100% woman-led and almost 100% female membership. And that's really because of the migration pattern in Tlaxcala, which is majority male. So most of the, it's not so much that most of the men have left, but most of the people who have left are men. And so the people who form this organization are the family members of migrants that were really a lot of the women who became head of household or daughters or sisters, et cetera. And so one of the first projects that they engaged in was how could they find a way to visit their family members in the United States? And they found some really creative ways of creating a culturally unique program. So they got, for the immigration lawyers on Zoom and in the room, they got a P visa to come to do a culturally unique program. And they were able to actually see their family members for the first time, for some of them in decades. So they've been engaging in programs like that. And then they also have a cooperative, and FIAB does this as well. They have cooperatives where people are producing, in the case of Kafami, they're producing sort of products based on Nahuatl. Nahuatl is the language that they speak and the sort of community that they belong to, based on Nahuatl traditional plant-based medicines. And in Oaxaca, they're producing things based on sort of, moles, which are very sort of indicative of Oaxacan culture. And so I guess the lesson for organizing here, I think in some ways is about getting back a little bit to that old school in-person, meet people, understand where people are coming from, figure out where you're going, and then also having collective action that backs up demands, if you're making demands from a state in particular. I meant to mention Kafami also has engaged in a lot of fairly large actions at the state and even at the federal level, because they're fairly close to Mexico City, to try to demand a return of resources to their communities. So I don't know if that is a satisfactory answer to the question, but that's sort of where I was taking the question.
There was another hand back here.
Thank you very much. I had a question back in the lens, looking through the lens of racial capitalism, and it's more modern based on today and the types of enforcement policies that we're seeing. It would strike me that there are a lot of large industries that would benefit from an influx of cheap labor. So why is it that Geocor and Palantir and the sort of those who would benefit from the deportation and the detention of undocumented immigrants are sort of, is there a tension there? Is big agriculture sort of pushing for a different sort of enforcement mechanism? Are they all going in the same direction? I'm just curious if.
Yeah, I appreciate this opportunity to kind of tease that out because it's actually from what I found from the stories of people that I interviewed is that both things are happening at the same time, right? Some companies like the Geocors and the Palantirs are making money from enforcement, but enforcement isn't total. So even as enforcement is getting stepped up, a lot of the people I interviewed were able to enter the United States without authorization. They might have been arrested, more times than they were in the past. They might have been arrested 3-4 times, but eventually they make it into the United States. And I think it's by design because that then allows big agriculture to have access to the workers that they're used to and that they need. I remember, so one of the quotes that's in the book is, as I was writing the book, it was during the first Trump administration. And one of the things that Trump did in the first year of his first administration was he met with large agricultural corporations in Michigan. And what he told them was, we're going to do all of this. We're going to, make sure that we control the borders, but don't worry. We know you need your workers. And so we're going to let them in, right? And so that to me tells the whole story. It's, yes, we're going to engage in enforcement, but only to the extent that it keeps out certain kinds of people and allows other people in. And I think the other thing I didn't mention when the slide was up about the increase in enforcement spending is that increase occurs a little bit before, but it really starts to escalate as the demographics of who's entering the country changes, right? Enforcement really starts to escalate when it's not single men anymore. It's families with children who are trying to enter. And so that doesn't really make sense from a security perspective. Like, what is the security threat of families with children? But it does make sense if you're looking at it from a racial capitalist perspective, because you can make money off of them and you can still make money off the workers.
One thing I would just append to that too is that immigration policy often, with the one hand giveth, the other taketh away. And so the other thing that's happening parallel to enforcement increasing is a big push to revive guest worker programs.
Right.
And the kind of slippery slope of guest worker programs are, one, that they end up generating additional undocumented migration, as we saw with the Bracero program and as we see with overstays of H-2 visas. But they also become this kind of policy fiction that they will somehow fill the gap of the 5.2% of the civilian labor force that is unauthorized, much higher in other industries, including immigration. And so those policymakers are talking out of both sides of their mouth. And I do think, to the frustration of growers who face an obviously different set of costs associated with participating in the H-2 program. So
yeah.
we can have that broader conversation as well.
Yeah. So. And I'll just add one other thing about the H-2 program since you brought it up, which is to say that just as growers started using the H-2 program more, kind of because they had to, because they didn't have quite as much access to unauthorized workers as they did previously, they also reduced the prevailing wage that they had to pay to those same workers. So, and this was really during the time of the pandemic when all these farm workers were being declared as essential workers, but at the same time, the regulations that were protecting their wages were being dismantled, right? And so they're actually kind of essentially, making the H-2A workers in a similar position as the unauthorized workers were in terms of wage protections and other kinds of things.
So we have time for two more questions. So one audience question here and one final Zoom question.
You kind of touched on the question that I was going to ask. I was going to ask about the H-2A guest worker program, and specifically that it's also, I was not aware that the prevailing wage was being lowered in that program during COVID. And I think that the systems are also similar to undocumented, even when the prevailing wage was up, because in some way the undocumented worker can go to other farms, whereas the H-2A worker cannot. The H-2A worker sort of has like a branded thing on his or her back that to be deported back because of the program. They're sort of like part of the program, right? But my question was more like how, if the H-2A program was viewed differently by the people that you interviewed, and whether, because I represented farm workers for a very long time, and so this was of huge interest to me. So thank you, Professor Shah, for writing the book, and I can't wait to read it. But I was just wondering, because we always came across people that thought the H-2A program was like the panacea, when in fact, with a bad grower, it could really be more of a nightmare than coming here unauthorized.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll give one example, and I won't say that this anecdote explains everything, but there is one of the stories in the book is about a gentleman who migrated without authorization for years, and then just when the border enforcement started to ratchet up, he was like, this is becoming a little bit difficult. So he convinced his employer to apply for him for an H-2A. So one time he entered with an H-2A, and he found that it was so much more of a pain, and he was not getting paid better, and he felt like now all of a sudden he was in this position where he couldn't really complain about the conditions, because if he did, he would be blacklisted from applying for an H-2A again. And so he started coming back without authorization again. And he went to a different employer. And so, I think that you're right. I think the H-2A is not really the panacea. And one of the suggestions I made in the book is that it might be, in order to kind of change the power dynamics, I propose that what if it was possible for the workers themselves to sponsor themselves, right? What if they didn't need employer sponsorship, but rather could rely on the experience they have in the industries that they've worked in to sponsor themselves? And that would sort of allow them maybe a little bit more bargaining power, and also take the employer, blacklisting sort of out of the equation.
And I would add, for those interested in following this thread, that the H-2 program has become a really critical piece of the questions around enforcement in Central America, also attempting to sell a fiction that the safe mobility scheme that you simply need is to hand someone a guest worker visa, and that will somehow become a deterrent to unauthorized crossing. USAID and others are very involved in kind of training this. We'll see where that ends up. But many advocacy organizations doing amazing work find themselves having to navigate these very contradictory spaces. So,
yeah, definitely.
And so we have a final Zoom question. What nonprofit organization services are in protection of legal immigrant safety and rights in the United States?
So many. There are really so many. In the United States, or can we limit it to Massachusetts? I guess I would say there's a number of organizations locally that are doing really amazing work, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit more about at the national level as well. I first want to say I think some of our state level officials are also doing really good work, like the guidances that the Attorney General's office has put out about what, in fact, are people's rights. I think that, the Political Asylum and Immigrant Representation Project has been doing really great work. The Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition has been doing really great work. They've been putting out trainings for people to be able to know their rights, but also prepare in the worst case scenarios, also understanding what does it mean to be detained, what does that look like, how do you find somebody if they've been detained. I feel like this is a terrible question because I'm always going to leave somebody out, but these are the organizations that sort of come to mind initially, and then of course the ACLU of Massachusetts, which has been was at the forefront during the first Trump administration of ensuring that the worst policies weren't going to just be implemented without a fight in the courts, and they're doing that again. And at the national level, there's also the National Immigration Law Center, which does a really amazing job of doing policy analysis. The American Immigration Council, which has come out with a really good report on the financial costs of mass deportation. Again, going back to this idea of what else could we be using that money for? But maybe what we could do is provide a link where there's more organizations, but those are the ones that come to mind.
I would just generally argue that, if you're interested in becoming involved or learning how to support these groups, start local. Many of these national groups are doing capacity building for local organizations, and especially in regions where perhaps the history of immigrant services and immigrant organizing is either newer or thinner, you may not have the same infrastructure. And so the answer and the infrastructure needed for each of these places may look a little different, for example, upstate New York to what you have here in Boston. And so I would encourage sometimes that immigrant organizing isn't necessarily branded as immigrant organizing. Sometimes it looks like a church, or sometimes it looks like a worker center. So, but those are great suggestions, and many of our colleagues in common are leading them. So thanks.
Yeah.
Well, Ragini and Shannon, thank you so much for being a part of this important conversation. I'd like to thank our audience for your